The Duke visited his abandoned house for the last time. He just wanted to see it once more before he sold it. He pushed the door open, and the candles were lit. The fire was burning, and there were small, muddy boots by the front door. Then she walked out of the kitchen. His wife, the woman he had buried, the woman whose grave he had stood over in the rain. The pot dropped from her hands. Neither of them moved. Then a small voice came from the top of the staircase.
Mama, who is that man?
Who is that man? His own son did not know his face. And in that moment, the Duke understood. Someone had not just lied to him. Someone had stolen 3 years of his life. Welcome to Duke and Duchess. Subscribe now, because what happens next will shock you completely. Let us start from the beginning and leave nothing out. Blackmore Hall was the kind of house that made people stop and stare. It sat on the highest hill in Northumberland like it owned the whole county, and in many ways it did. 3 floors of pale stone, 12 chimneys, windows so tall you could see them from the road a mile away, gardens that took 6 men to maintain, stables that housed 12 horses, a kitchen that never stopped producing food from before sunrise until late into the evening. It had belonged to the Ashworth family for 300 years, and on this particular April morning in 1917, it belonged to Edward Ashworth, the Duke of Blackmore, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that powerful men are often quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that speaking less means every word lands harder. Edward was standing in the master bedroom, pulling on his military coat while his valet moved silently around him, checking buttons and straightening collars. The bedroom was large and warm. A fire burned in the enormous stone fireplace. Heavy curtains kept out the gray April morning. The furniture was all dark, solid oak, the kind built to last centuries and doing exactly that. Edward was not looking at any of it. He was looking at his wife. Charlotte Ashworth sat at the writing desk on the far side of the room, pretending to read correspondence. She was 28 years old, copper-haired, straight-backed, wearing a morning dress of deep green wool that suited her in the way that simple things suited women who did not need decoration. She was one of the most composed people Edward had ever known. She did not cry easily. She did not panic. She faced difficult things directly and without drama. She had been pretending to read the same letter for 20 minutes. Edward knew this. He said nothing about it. Their son, Thomas, was on the hearthrug, 2 years old, completely cheerful, attempting to convince the family wolfhound, a vast gray animal of extreme age and extremely limited enthusiasm, to participate in a game involving a wooden horse and a great deal of enthusiastic instruction from Thomas. The wolfhound was not participating. Thomas did not appear discouraged. The valet finished and quietly left the room. Edward crossed to Charlotte. She stood before he reached her. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said. He kissed her forehead, her cheek, then properly. She kept her hands flat at her sides, because if she held on to him, she would not let go. He picked up Thomas. Thomas grabbed Edward's face with both hands and examined it with great seriousness. Then he patted both cheeks approvingly and went back to looking at the wolfhound. Edward held him for a long time. Then he put him down. Downstairs in the estate yard, his estate manager, William Graves, was overseeing the preparation of the carriage. William was 36, lean and precise, educated at Cambridge alongside Edward, where they had been close friends for 15 years. He managed Blackmore Hall with the kind of thoroughness that meant Edward never had to worry about it. He was loyal, reliable, trusted completely. William did not look up at the master bedroom window while he worked, but he knew which window it was. The carriage was ready. Edward came down the main staircase. The household staff were assembled in the entrance hall to see him off. Cook, housemaids, footmen, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, who had worked at the Hall for 30 years and whose opinion of Edward was that he was the best of the Ashworths, and she had known 4 of them personally. Edward thanked each of them by name. Charlotte walked him to the front steps, Thomas on her hip, the wolfhound at her heel. The gravel crunched under Edward's boots as he walked to the waiting carriage. He handed his traveling case up, climbed in, turned back once. Charlotte was on the top step, straight-backed, head high, Thomas waving at nothing in particular, the morning light on her copper hair. She raised her hand. He raised his. The horses moved forward. The carriage rolled down the oak-lined drive. The hall disappeared from view. Charlotte stood on the steps until the sound of the wheels faded completely into the moorland silence. Then she looked at her son. Thomas was still waving. She pulled him close, turned, went inside, and closed the door on the last normal morning either of them would know for a very long time. The first thing Charlotte did after Edward left was cry. Not in front of anyone. Not in front of Thomas or Mrs. Pemberton or the housemaids who moved through the hall with careful, quiet faces, pretending not to notice that their mistress was holding herself together with the particular determination of a woman who has decided that falling apart is simply not available to her. She cried in the master bedroom at midnight with the door locked and a pillow pressed over her face so no one would hear. She cried for exactly 1 hour. Then she washed her face, went to bed, set her mind to what needed doing, and did not cry again for a very long time. Charlotte ran Blackmore Hall the way she did everything, thoroughly, without complaint, without waiting for someone else to take charge. Every morning before Thomas woke, she sat at the writing desk in the master bedroom with the household accounts spread before her and a single candle burning, and went through every number with the focused attention of a woman who understood that a great estate did not run itself simply because the man who owned it was away at war. She wrote to Edward every week without fail, long, detailed letters filled with ordinary things. Thomas learning to walk downstairs properly, the wolfhound's latest opinions on cold weather, the state of the kitchen garden, the tenant farmer on the north boundary who had a long-running dispute with his neighbor about a fence that Charlotte had now resolved twice and expected to resolve again. She kept fear out of the letters entirely. She understood that fear was a weight a man at the front could not put down, and she refused to add to what he was already carrying. She opened Blackmore Hall as a small convalescent space for returning officers from the county. It was her idea. She organized it entirely herself over William Graves's mild suggestion that it might be a great deal of work. Charlotte thanked him for his concern and proceeded anyway. She moved through the convalescent rooms every day, supervising, checking, talking to men who needed someone to talk to, reading to those whose eyes were too damaged or too exhausted, writing letters home for those whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She was not trained as a nurse. She learned what she needed to learn and did not make a fuss about it. Thomas grew steadily through that year. He was a serious boy, watchful. He absorbed everything around him with the quiet attention of a child who understood more than the adults expected. He asked about his father with the regularity of a child who has accepted an answer but not quite finished processing it. Charlotte answered every question honestly and completely. She kept a portrait of Edward on the writing desk, a small painting from their first year of marriage. She pointed at it when Thomas asked questions. She said, "Your father is brave and good, and he is coming home." She believed this completely. William Graves was at the hall every day. He managed the estate accounts, he dealt with tenant matters and supply problems, and the dozen complications that came with running a large property during wartime. He was efficient and correct, and always at exactly the right professional distance. Charlotte was grateful for him, genuinely. He made an impossible situation manageable, and he never asked for acknowledgement, and he never overstepped. She trusted him entirely.
Winter arrived hard that year, the coldest in a decade. The moors froze solid, the carriageway iced so badly that the horses could barely manage it. Coal was rationed. Charlotte gave the convalescent officers the best of what remained and said nothing to the household staff about managing with less because they were already managing with less without being told. On the 14th of February, 1918, a candle fell in the east wing. The young lieutenant whose candle it was had a fever and had fallen asleep without extinguishing it against specific instruction. By the time the household woke, the east corridor was fully burning. The stable hands formed a bucket chain from the courtyard well. The coachman rode hard through the frozen dark for help. Charlotte got Thomas out first. She handed him to Mrs. Pemberton in the courtyard with instructions that could not be argued with. Then she went back inside. She got every living person out of the east wing. 2 people did not survive, a young housemaid named Ellen and a man found in the east passage whose presence at the hall that night was never fully explained. Charlotte stood in the courtyard in her nightgown, watching the last of the fire burn, ash on her face, Thomas asleep against Mrs. Pemberton's shoulder, the February cold cutting through everything. William Graves arrived from the estate cottage within the hour. He took one look at Charlotte and began managing everything immediately. She let him. She had nothing left to manage with. She did not know that while she stood there in the cold watching the east wing burn, William Graves was already composing in his mind the letter he was going to write to her husband.
William Graves wrote 2 letters in the days after the fire. The first went to Edward at the front. It was written on Blackmore estate notepaper in William's neat, careful hand. It carried the household seal. It informed the Duke of Blackmore that his wife Charlotte and his young son Thomas had perished in the fire at Blackmore Hall on the 14th of February, that every effort had been made, that nothing could be saved, that William would manage the estate in the Duke's absence, and that the Duke should not abandon his post for the sake of the dead when the living still needed him at the front. Every word was chosen with precision, every sentence constructed to be believable. The tone was exactly right, formal, sorrowful, controlled. The kind of letter a loyal estate manager writes when he has terrible news to deliver and no good way to deliver it. It was also a lie from beginning to end. Charlotte and Thomas were alive, unhurt, shaken and grieving the loss of the East Wing and the staff who had not survived, but completely and entirely alive. William folded the letter, sealed it, had it sent through military post without hesitation. The second thing he did was ride to Hexham. Hexham was the nearest market town, 12 miles across frozen moorland, a hard 2-hour ride in February cold on a horse that was not built for speed. William made it in an hour and 40 minutes. At the telegraph office, he sent a message to the War Office under a name that was not his own. He had prepared the name carefully, a clerk, a position that sounded real, a request for casualty confirmation that would generate a specific response. He had thought about this for longer than he would ever admit to anyone. He had the details exactly right. 3 days later, a telegram arrived at Blackmore Hall, addressed to Charlotte. It informed the Duchess of Blackmore that her husband, Edward James Ashworth, Duke of Blackmore, had been killed in action on the Western Front on the 9th of February 1918, 5 days before the fire. William had timed it deliberately. He understood Charlotte. He understood that if the telegram arrived too close to the fire, she might question the coincidence. Separated by 5 days, with the fire already destroying her and the grief already sitting in her chest, the telegram would simply feel like the world continuing to collapse, one more blow on top of everything else. He was right. Charlotte read the telegram standing in the entrance hall with William beside her. She read it once. Her face did not change in the way that faces sometimes do not change when the news is too large for an immediate expression. She folded it, handed it back to William, walked upstairs, and did not come down for 3 days. William managed everything, the household, Thomas, who was confused and frightened and kept asking where his mother was, the estate,
the correspondence, the practical devastation of sudden widowhood degenerated more paperwork and decisions than most people understood. He was steady and calm and completely present through all of it. On the fourth day, Charlotte came downstairs, pale, quiet, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who has made a decision to keep going even when every part of her wants to stop. She sat at the breakfast table, drank her tea, asked William for a summary of estate matters, listened to the summary, gave her instructions. Thomas came and sat beside her. She put her arm around him. She told him that morning that his father had gone to heaven. Thomas asked if heaven was far away. Charlotte said yes, very far. Thomas nodded carefully and went back to his porridge. Charlotte kept her face entirely still. William sat across the table and watched her and felt something that a better man would have been ashamed of. He was not yet ashamed. He was patient. He had waited 20 years for this moment, and he was very good at waiting.
William Graves had loved Charlotte Pemberton since she was 17 years old. Before she was Charlotte Ashworth, before the title, before Blackmore Hall and the copper-haired Duchess and the life that Edward built around her. Back when she was simply the rector's daughter from a small Shropshire village, sharp-minded and copper-haired and completely unaware of the effect she had on people. William had grown up in the same county. He had known her since childhood. He had watched her grow from a serious, quiet girl into a remarkable young woman, and he had felt what he felt with the patient certainty of someone who believes that love, if it is real enough, eventually finds its way to where it belongs. Then Edward Ashworth walked into Charlotte's life at a house party in the summer of 1912. William was already Edward's estate manager by then, already his closest friend from their Cambridge years. He was standing in the same room when Edward first spoke to Charlotte. He watched it happen in real time, the way Edward moved toward her, the way Charlotte turned, the way something shifted in both of them almost immediately. He stood very still and felt something close inside him like a door. He was at their wedding a year later. He stood in the church in his best coat and watched Edward put the ring on Charlotte's finger and told himself that the feeling would pass with time, that it was simply affection sharpened by proximity, that a man of his intelligence and self-discipline could manage this perfectly well. It did not pass. For 5 years he managed Blackmore Hall with perfect professionalism. He was correct and efficient and loyal, and he never once said or did anything that crossed any line. He buried what he felt under work and duty and the genuine friendship he had with Edward, which was real even alongside everything else. But he watched. And then Edward went to war, and William was alone at Blackmore Hall with Charlotte. For a year he continued to be exactly what he had always been, professional, respectful, useful. He told himself this was simply who he was, that his behavior was proof of his character. The fire changed something. Not in one moment, not with one decision. It shifted gradually in the days after the fire, as William stood at the center of Charlotte's collapsing world and felt, for the first time in his life, completely necessary to her. She looked at him the way she had never looked at him before, with dependence, with gratitude, with the particular trust of someone who has run out of people to rely on and found that one person remains. He built the lie from that feeling. He told himself it was not entirely wrong, that Edward was at war and might not survive anyway, that Charlotte deserved someone present who loved her, that he was simply accelerating something that fate might have delivered eventually. He was very good at convincing himself. 8 months after the fire, on a September evening, he told Charlotte he loved her. They were in the drawing room, fire burning, Thomas long asleep upstairs, the hall quiet around them. Charlotte was reading. He simply said it, without drama, as a statement of fact he could no longer keep inside. Charlotte was silent for a long time after he spoke. She did not say yes, she did not say no. She said she was not ready for that conversation. He said he simply needed her to know. He did not press. He did not change his behavior.
He continued to be exactly what he had been, steady, present, patient, and allowed the knowledge to sit between them and do its quiet work. Charlotte thought about Edward every single day. She kept his letters in a box. She still slept on her side of the bed. She was not looking for a replacement. She was not falling in love with William. But she was tired and alone, and 29 years old, with a child to raise and an estate to manage, and an entire future ahead of her that felt like a road she had to walk completely by herself. She was turning it over. She had not yet decided. And then the front door of Blackmore Hall opened, and everything William had built for 2 years came apart in a single second.
London had not been kind to Edward Ashworth. Not that he had given it much chance to be kind. He moved through the city in the 8 months after the war ended the way a man moves through a place he does not intend to stay. Rented rooms, club dinners with men who tried to talk about the war and men who tried very hard not to. Invitations to country houses he accepted and then sat through with the polite distance of someone whose mind was always somewhere else. He drank moderately, slept poorly, existed without direction. He had nothing to go back to. His wife was dead. His son was dead. Blackmore Hall was being managed by William. There was no urgency that required his presence. There was nothing that required anything of him at all, and he found that this was its own particular kind of suffering. He carried the letter William had sent to the front in his coat pocket. He did not know why he kept it. He simply could not bring himself to throw it away. On an afternoon in November, he was riding in a hired carriage through a London street when the carriage slowed for traffic. On the pavement to his left, a woman was walking, copper-haired, straight-backed, moving with a particular purposeful stride that he would have known anywhere, holding the hand of a small boy beside her. The carriage moved forward before he could be certain. He told himself it was nothing. He knew what grief did to men. He had seen it at the front, grown men certain they heard their dead wives in the wind. He was not going to become that. He hired a horse at the next coaching inn he passed. He rode north without stopping. Fresh horses at Newcastle. The last stretch in a hired carriage through the Northumberland dark. The roads frozen. The sky enormous with stars. The moorland black and silent on either side. He told himself the entire journey that he was being irrational. He did not stop. Blackmore Hall appeared on the hill at 10:30, and every window in the west wing was burning with warm gold light. Edward sat in the carriage at the gate for a full minute without moving. Then he told the driver to go through. The gravel of the drive sounded exactly as it always had under the carriage wheels. The oak trees lined both sides exactly as they always had. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the chimneys into the cold night air. Edward stepped down from the carriage and stood in the dark and breathed it in. He took his own key from his coat pocket. The front door opened. The entrance hall was exactly as he had left it nearly 3 years ago. The black and white marble floor, the great staircase, the portraits along the walls, the wolfhound's empty basket by the morning room door. The wolfhound had been old when he left. It was gone now, but nobody had moved the basket. He stood in the silence of his own house and felt something pull very tight in his chest. Then a door opened off the main corridor, and Charlotte walked out. Dark blue silk dress, copper hair pinned up with one piece escaping at the temple, exactly as it always did. Candle in her hand because she had heard the front door and come to look and had not thought to be frightened. She was not a woman who frightened easily in her own house. She looked up. She saw him. The candle tilted sideways in her hand. She grabbed the doorframe. Edward stood completely still. The candle flame trembled in the draft from the open door. The fire crackled in the morning room behind Charlotte. The house was absolutely silent around them. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Charlotte said his name. Just his name. Nothing else. In a voice he had not heard in 3 years that went through him like the first warm day after a long winter. He crossed the hall in 7 steps, stood directly in front of her, looked at her face, and from the top of the staircase, in a small night-gowned figure holding his own candle, having awoken at the sound of voices, a 5-year-old said, "Mama, who is that man?"
Who is that man?
Edward looked up at his son. His son looked down at the stranger. Charlotte put her free hand over her mouth. and Edward Ashworth, who had not cried once in 3 years of war, stood in his own entrance hall and could not find a single word. Mrs. Pemberton appeared from nowhere the way she always had. She took one look at the situation in the entrance hall, the Duke standing in his traveling coat, the Duchess with her hand over her mouth, the young Lord Thomas on the stairs in his nightgown, and made 3 immediate decisions. She sent Thomas back to bed with the tone of voice that had never failed to work on any child in 40 years of service. She instructed the night footman to bring tea to the drawing room, and she disappeared back into the depths of the house without a word, because Mrs. Pemberton understood better than most that there were moments when the most useful thing a person could do was remove themselves completely. Edward and Charlotte sat in the drawing room. The fire was built up high. The tea came and went cold. Outside, the November wind moved across the moors, making the old house settle and creak around them in the way it always had. Inside the room was very still. Charlotte spoke first. She did not prepare what she was going to say. She simply started at the beginning and went to the end without stopping and left nothing out. The fire, the terrible days afterward, William arriving and taking charge of everything, the telegram that came 3 days later with the War Office seal and the official language and her husband's name in black ink stating he had been killed in action on the 9th of February. How she had stood in this same entrance hall and read it and felt the floor move underneath her. The months that followed, managing the estate, raising Thomas, the grief that came in waves at unpredictable hours, the way she had learned to function around it because functioning was the only option available to her. William's presence through all of it, his consistency, his patience, the way he had made an impossible situation manageable every single day for nearly 2 years. And then September, the drawing room, the fire. William saying words she had not been prepared for. Her response, her silence, what she had said and what she had not said, what she had been turning over since. She told Edward everything because the only thing worse than telling him was not telling him. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Edward reached into his coat pocket. He took out the letter, the one that had arrived at the front in March 1918, the one he had carried unopened for 8 months and had finally read on a train platform in France the day after the war ended. He placed it on the table between them. Charlotte picked it up. She read it. The color left her face completely. She set it down very carefully. "He told me you were dead," she said. "He told me you were dead," Edward said. They looked at each other across the fireplace. "He told us both," Charlotte said quietly. Edward said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely level, in the way that some men's voices go level when the emotion underneath is too large to allow any movement at all. "How close were you," he said, "to saying yes?" Charlotte did not look away from him. "I had not decided," she said. "I want you to know that. I had not decided." "I know, but how close?" Charlotte held his gaze. "Close enough that I am telling you," she said, "because I will begin with anything hidden between us." Another long silence. The fire settled. A log shifted and sent a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind moved across the roof. Edward stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the November dark. Charlotte watched him. She did not go to him. She understood that he needed the distance. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around. His face had the look of a man who has picked up something very heavy and decided to carry it rather than put it down. "I am not going anywhere," he said. Charlotte let out a breath she had been holding since the moment she walked out of the corridor and found him standing in the hall. "Neither am I," she said. They did not fall into each other's arms. They did not make dramatic declarations. They sat back down on opposite sides of the fireplace and drank cold tea and talked until the candles burned low and the fire died down to embers and the November sky outside began to show the first gray suggestion of morning. And upstairs, Thomas slept on completely, unbothered, having decided that the tall stranger in the hall was probably not dangerous and that whatever was happening could be investigated properly in the morning. Over the next 2 days, Edward spoke to everyone. He began with Mrs. Pemberton. He sat with her in the housekeeper's room the morning after his return, a small, warm room off the main kitchen that smelled of dried lavender and beeswax, and he asked her to tell him everything she remembered from the night of the fire onward. Mrs. Pemberton told him, all of it, in the precise sequential way of a woman who had been paying attention to everything that happened in that house for 30 years and had kept it organized in her memory because she suspected that one day someone would need to hear it. The telegram, the timing, the way William had managed the news, the way he had managed Charlotte afterward, the gradual shift in his presence at the hall from estate manager to something harder to name, the September evening that Mrs. Pemberton had not been present for, but had understood from Charlotte's changed manner the following morning. Mrs. Pemberton told Edward all of this in a level voice, with her hands folded in her lap. When she finished, she looked at him directly. "I did not know what to do with what I suspected, Your Grace," she said. "I am sorry I did not find a way to reach you." "You had no reason to believe I was alive," Edward said. "Neither did anyone else." He thanked her, went to find the coachman, then the stable master, then each member of the household staff who had been present throughout. Each conversation added another piece. Each piece made the picture clearer and worse in equal measure. The forged identity William had used at the telegraph office, the careful timing of the telegram, the months of positioning, the way William had controlled what information the household sent out and what came in. Small details that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. By the end of the second day, the full architecture of what William had built was completely visible. Thomas, meanwhile, had conducted his own independent assessment of the situation. He appeared at Edward's elbow on the morning of the second day, while Edward was standing in the stable yard looking at the horses. Thomas stood beside him for a moment without speaking. Then he pointed at the large bay mare in the nearest paddock. "That one is called Bess," Thomas said. "She does not like strangers." "Noted," Edward said. "She likes me," Thomas added. "Also noted," Edward said. Thomas considered him for another moment. Then he went back inside. An hour later, he returned carrying a small wooden horse, which he presented to Edward without explanation, and then retreated to a safe observational distance to watch what happened next. Edward looked at the wooden horse. Then he sat down on the ground right there in the stable yard. Thomas stared at him. Edward patted the ground beside him. Thomas came and sat down. They examined the wooden horse together for a while without speaking. Charlotte watched this from the stable yard gate and had to walk away before she did something undignified with her face. On the morning of the third day, Edward sent a note to the estate cottage. 4 words. "Library, 10 o'clock, come." He told Charlotte what he was going to do. Charlotte asked what he intended to say. "The truth. And then I am going to listen to whatever he says, and then it will be finished." Charlotte looked at him. "Whatever he says," she repeated carefully. "Yes," Edward said. "Even if what he says makes it worse? Especially then, because I need to know all of it, every piece, so that nothing comes back later." Charlotte nodded slowly. "And after?" she asked. Edward picked up his coat. "After," he said, "we begin."
William arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He came on horseback across the frozen ground from the estate cottage. He was dressed correctly in his good coat. His boots were clean. His bearing was composed. He handed his horse to the stable boy without looking up at the hall windows, and walked to the front door and knocked. Mrs. Pemberton opened the door. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that said everything she thought of him without a single word being spoken. Then she turned and led him through the entrance hall to the library without speaking. The library at Blackmore Hall ran the full length of the west wing ground floor. Floor to ceiling shelves on every wall, a fireplace at each end, long windows looking out over the parkland, heavy oak reading tables down the center, the smell of old leather and wood smoke, and 300 years of Ashworth family history. Edward was standing at the far window when William entered, looking out at the parkland. The November morning was bright and cold. 2 horses moved in the paddock below. The moors stretched away to the horizon. He did not turn around immediately. William stood inside the door and waited. After a long moment, Edward turned. They looked at each other across the length of the library. 2 men who had been friends since the age of 19, who had shared everything that young men share: university years, ambitions, difficulties, the particular closeness of a friendship that forms before either person fully knows who they are. Edward gestured to the chair at the near end of the reading table. William sat. Edward remained standing. What passed between them over the next 4 hours was never recorded by either man. No letter, no account, no version of events passed to anyone else in any form. The household heard nothing through the heavy library door, not even Mrs. Pemberton, who had positioned herself with unnecessary tasks in the corridor for the first 30 minutes before accepting that the oak door was doing its job. What came out of that library was this: William resigned as estate manager of Blackmore Hall, effective immediately. He would leave Northumberland within the week. He would not be prosecuted. He would not be contacted again. He would remove himself from their lives completely and permanently. William accepted every condition without argument. He asked one question at the door before he left. "Is she well?" Edward looked at him across the room for a long moment. "She will be," he said. William nodded once, put on his hat, walked out of the library, walked through the entrance hall, opened the front door, and walked out of Blackmore Hall forever. Edward stood at the library window and watched him collect his horse from the stable boy and ride away down the drive. The horse's breath steamed in the cold morning air. The oak trees lined both sides. The frozen ground was hard under the hooves. William reached the bend in the drive, did not look back, disappeared from view. Edward stood at the window for a long time after he was gone. 15 years of friendship, built carefully, trusted completely, ended not by an argument or a falling out or the natural drifting that some friendships take over time, ended by a choice, one long, deliberate, patient, terrible choice. He stood at the window until Thomas appeared in the library doorway, having escaped whatever supervision had been arranged for him, and announced that Bess, the bay mare, had allowed him to feed her from his hand that morning, which was a significant development, and Edward needed to know immediately. Edward turned from the window. He looked at his son. "Show me," he said. They went to the stables.
Winter at Blackmore Hall was long that year. Not because of cold or shortage. Those things Edward and Charlotte had both survived before and thought nothing of. It was long because of the particular difficulty of 2 people who loved each other deeply, trying to find their way back to each other across a distance that had nothing to do with miles. Edward was home, fully present, entirely committed to being there. He rose early, managed the estate, spent time with Thomas in the mornings, was at dinner every evening. He was not absent in any physical sense, but the war had left things in him that he had not yet named. He slept with the bedroom window open, regardless of temperature. He went very still sometimes in the middle of ordinary moments for no visible reason. He did not talk about the front. Charlotte did not ask. They both understood without discussing it that those things would come out when they were ready and not before. Charlotte carried her own weight, the guilt that she knew was not entirely rational but could not fully dismiss. She had not done anything wrong. She had believed a lie constructed by a man she trusted and had been grieving and vulnerable and entirely human. She knew all of this. She also knew that knowledge and feeling are not always the same thing, and that the feeling would take time. They were careful with each other in those first weeks, too careful. The carefulness had the quality of 2 people so afraid of causing pain that they held everything at a slight distance, and that distance had its own particular loneliness. Thomas was the solution to this, without knowing he was the solution to anything. Thomas required things, constantly and without apology.
He required breakfast opinions and stable yard visits, and someone to explain why the bay mare was called Bess and not something better. He required his wooden horse collection to be acknowledged and his progress with the real horses to be observed and commented upon. He required stories at bedtime, and he had strong views about which stories were acceptable. He required both of his parents, at the same time, together, in the same room. There is no quicker way to rebuild a marriage than a 6-year-old who needs both parents simultaneously for tasks that genuinely require two people. Edward and Charlotte found themselves standing in the same spaces, talking over Thomas's head about practical things, laughing sometimes at something Thomas said or did, with the unguarded laughter that is impossible to manufacture. Moving around each other in the kitchen on the evenings when the cook was off and Charlotte made something simple, and Edward sat at the kitchen table with Thomas and a glass of wine and offered opinions that Charlotte ignored. The kitchen evenings became important. Neither of them named this, it was simply noticed. On a Sunday morning in December, a rare winter sun lit the parkland with brilliant pale gold light. Edward took Thomas to the stable yard to practice approaching the horses properly. Charlotte watched from the gate. Edward crouched beside Thomas with one hand lightly on his small shoulder and spoke quietly, instruction, encouragement, patience, and the bay mare lowered her enormous head, and Thomas reached up and touched her nose. Thomas turned to look at his father with the expression of a person who has just accomplished something magnificent. Edward laughed. A real laugh, completely open, the first one Charlotte had heard from him since he came back. She held on to the gate. Edward looked up and saw her. They looked at each other across the stable yard, Thomas between them, the horses around them, the winter sun on everything. Edward held out his hand. Charlotte opened the gate and walked across the yard and took it. They stood like that for a while, not saying anything, not needing to. Thomas was already moving toward the next horse with the confidence of someone who has cracked the code and intends to apply it immediately.
Spring came to Blackmore Hall like a long breath let out. The moors turned from winter brown to green almost overnight, the way they always did in Northumberland, sudden and total, as though the land had simply decided. The kitchen garden came back. The mares produced foals. Thomas named one of them Edward without asking permission, and then looked at his father with the careful expression of someone who has done something bold and is waiting to see how it lands. Edward looked at the foal. "Good name," he said. Thomas beamed. The East Wing reconstruction began in April. Charlotte had spent the winter planning it with an architect from Newcastle, a young man with intelligent ideas who listened carefully and adjusted where she directed him. She was not rebuilding what had been there before. She was building something new that still belonged to the hall. Same pale limestone, same proportions, same high windows, but distinctly of now, distinctly chosen rather than inherited. She designed the library herself, books floor to ceiling, a deep window seat, a fireplace that drew properly, unlike the old one, a connecting room for Thomas. She spent 3 weeks on the plans. Edward sat across the desk from her on the evenings she worked on them and read, and said nothing unless she asked. When she asked, he was honest. She ignored some of his honesty and incorporated some of it, and he found this entirely characteristic and entirely right. Summer came. Thomas turned 6. The birthday party was on the south lawn, trestle tables loaded with the cook's best efforts, strawberries from the garden, lemonade, a pony brought from the stable that Thomas rode with the gravity of someone performing an important ceremonial function. Every tenant family from the estate was invited. The lawn was full of people Charlotte had come to know over the years of running the hall alone. Edward stood at the edge of the lawn watching it all. Charlotte came and stood beside him with 2 glasses of lemonade. He took his without looking away from Thomas on the pony. "You built all of this," he said. "While I was gone, you kept all of this going." Charlotte looked out at the lawn. "It needed keeping," she said simply.
He looked at her then. She looked back at him. There was nothing complicated in it anymore. The carefulness was gone. What was there instead was simply what had always been there underneath everything. The particular steady warmth of two people who chose each other clearly and have paid enough for that choice to understand its value completely. He took her hand. Autumn came. The East Wing was finished. On the evening of the reopening, Charlotte walked through every room alone first. She needed to do this. She moved slowly through the new library, running her hand along the shelves, standing at the window, sitting in the window seat for a moment, looking out at the parkland going gold in the October evening light. The room smelled of new wood and plaster and linseed oil. It smelled of beginning. She went back to the corridor. Edward was in the doorway. Thomas was already somewhere inside, testing the floors at speed. "Well," Edward said. "Perfect," Charlotte said. Thomas appeared from the far end of the library, moving at considerable velocity in his stockinged feet, having discovered that the new floor was excellent for sliding. He demonstrated this twice. Edward watched him for a moment. Then he took off his own shoes. Charlotte stared at him. He slid the full length of the library in his stockinged feet. Thomas made a noise of absolute pure delight and came back for another run. Charlotte stood in the doorway of the room she had designed herself, in the house she had held together alone for 2 years, and watched the Duke of Blackmore slide across his own library floor.